to the Sporticos Football Stories podcast. It's Friday, the 5th of July, 2024. I'm Craig Resnik-Hanson, and today I'm joined by Andrew Mangan. Andrew is the founder of the award-winning Arsenal fan site ArseBlog and host of its related podcast ArseCast. Today we dive into Andrew's Arsenal origin story, the Mikel Arteta revolution, the legacy of Arsene Wenger, and so much more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our chat with the one and only Andrew Mangan. Hi, Andrew. Thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it. We've had a little bit of a break from the pod for the Euros, but the anticipation of the return of club football is growing every week. You can see it on Twitter, all the transfer speculation, confirmed transfers. As the Euros sort of is hobbling towards its close, people are getting more and more excited about the return of their clubs. But have you been keeping an eye on the Euros at all yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm, doing some coverage of it for our website, for our Patreon members. So yeah, I've been watching it all. It's kind of refreshing actually to watch football in a kind of dispassionate or detached way, because everything feels so acute with club football, and I have no skin in the game when it comes to this Euros. I'm Irish. There's no Irish team there. And it's kind of nice to just watch games and hope for a good game of football and not really care one way or the other who wins or what the outcome is. So you can just enjoy the football for what it is. So from that perspective, I've enjoyed this tournament actually.
Have you found yourself getting attached to any countries, especially the smaller ones, the underdog ones? Are you that kind of person that, even though you don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, you will get behind one or two countries who impress you or sort of, capture your attention?
I have to say I've enjoyed the fact that some of the so-called smaller nations have really come into this tournament with a clear idea of what it is they want to do, even if that is sort of accepting, let's say like Georgia, who came in and said, look, we're not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with any of the teams really in this tournament by having a lot of possession or whatever it might be. And they've recognized their strengths and they've been set up quite well tactically to get the most out of those. So I think, those teams in those contexts have been kind of fun to watch, sort of in stark contrast to England, let's say, who have all these good players, who have all these top talented Premier League players and haven't looked anything close to a cohesive unit. And I think that's been the thing I've enjoyed. I haven't sort of particularly nailed my colors to any mast, but when a game is going on, there's always that sense, isn't there, that you're kind of behind the underdog. And if the underdog can pull off a big shock, then there's something I think just fundamentally enjoyable about that as a football fan.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's been quite a few really nice shocks to see. And I think that's what's interesting about international football, maybe because the players don't spend as much time together. But you do get to see that fairly often, this example of teams that are made up of some, world-class players, but for some reason or other, it just doesn't work. You mentioned England there. France have been a bit underwhelming, but especially England, it's been, they've been really poor. And then on the other hand, you look at countries where on paper, maybe they don't have as many star names, but for some reason or other, their coaches, I guess, are able to bring it all together. But to bring it back to club football and Arsenal, I wanted to ask you mentioned there that it's been quite refreshing watching some of these games without having sort of, any particular emotional connection to it. But whether it's an international summer or not, do you tend to enjoy having a bit of time off from club football? Because, every year it's getting more and more games. It does get to be a bit much with the Premier League, with the Champions League, with all the other cup competitions. Or are you the kind of person who's just itching for it to restart as soon as it ends?
I don't mind the break, actually. I think you do need a bit of time to put one season behind you and come to terms with whatever has happened in that season, good, bad, or indifferent. You have to be able to just put it to one side eventually. The thing about summer as well is that, what we do on ArseBlog, we don't really down tools. It's not a case that at the end of the season we just stop doing what it is we do. We continue to do all of the things that people get during the season, with the website, with our news site, with our podcast, with our Patreon. So it's just a slight shift in emphasis, if you like. But the fact that, you don't have the games, you don't have the discussion, the debate, the worry, the angst, everything that comes with the weekend games is nice for a couple of months anyway. So you can gear yourself back up, refill the tanks if you like, and get ready to go again. Like, I'm very much a club football guy more than an international football guy. That is where sort of my passion is, or my heart is, if that's what you want to say. But it is nice to be able to sort of switch off and also think about, what's the direction? What is the plan for the summer? How are we going to be better? How are we going to improve? What can we expect from next season? All of those things are kind of fun. And when you add the transfer stuff on top of all that, it's a busy time of the year. It just doesn't really get any quieter these days.
Well, how did it all start for you with Arsenal? You mentioned that you're an Irishman. How did you get into the club? Was it a family member? Was it a particular player that you saw that you fell in love with? When and how did that all happen for you?
I grew up I was born in England and grew up in England, but my parents were Irish, as many Irish people did. They came to England for work in the 60s and 70s, and just being football mad. Arsenal had a lot of Irish players back in the 1970s, the likes of Liam Brady and David O'Leary, Frank Stapleton, Pat Rice, John Devine, Sammy Nelson, Pat Jennings, from Ireland and Northern Ireland. And at that point, I didn't really know the difference, or what made Northern Ireland that different from the Republic of Ireland. It was all just green to me. So I think really that is how I made my connection with Arsenal, simply because I was Irish in England, and those were a lot of Irish players in England.
And how has your relationship changed with the club over the years, for better or worse? Because over a long time supporting a club, we can find that fans' relationships can change and evolve over time. How would you say you would sum up the changes in your approach to Arsenal from when you first got into the club, I guess, as a small child, to now?
Oh my God. That's it's a difficult question to answer, to be honest, because I don't think my support or passion for Arsenal winning games of football and winning things, competing for trophies, all of that, I don't think that's any different now from when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager, or when I was in my 20s. I just, always want Arsenal to win and do well. And when there's success, it's great fun. And when it's not successful, it's not as much fun, right? That's, I think, just the life of a football fan. But obviously, through doing the website, I'm becoming, how do I put this? Just sort of more invested in the day-to-day stuff, which is just part and parcel of what I do now with the website. I think that changes things a little bit. You can become maybe a bit more cynical, I guess. But it's a different dynamic when you write about Arsenal and talk about Arsenal, or whatever football club it is you support. I think you have to try and be, on the one hand, you're biased, completely biased and passionate. And on the other, you have to try and be slightly objective about things, like the idea that if you were writing about your football club every day, and the football club could do no wrong, I think that would be, completely dishonest. So you have to try and tread that line a little bit. So it has, I don't think like I said, I don't think it's changed the way I feel about the football club, but obviously the interactions I have with other fans and with what I do gives it a different dimension, I think you would say. I think there's a deeper experience these days than there would have been when, if you want to put in inverted commas, I was just a fan. I'm still just a fan, but my work revolves around Arsenal, so it has changed things.
And what made you transition? How did that transition happen from being quote, just a fan to being not only just a fan, but also working very much revolved around Arsenal. I mean, the site is, it's award winning. The podcast is often credited as being the first, if not one of the first, sort of fan specific football podcasts.
Mm.
How did that all come about, and what sort of sparked that interest for you to go from just being someone watching the games, maybe talking to your friends about it at the pub, to being someone putting out their content about Arsenal?
I mean, it wasn't even known as content back then, ArseBlog started 22 years ago. It was like a web design experiment. And I've told the story before, but to cut a long story short, it was a web design experiment because I wanted to get into that kind of thing. And it just became clear that I was no good at web design, but I was quite good at writing. And I have a background in radio. So when podcasting started, I got in on the ground floor quite early there. The podcast began in 2006. And it just became part of my routine and part of what I did every day. And over time, it grew into what it is now. There was certainly no plan. When I started it back in 2002, there was no master plan. There was no whiteboard. There was no strategy. There was no thought that, well, certainly there was no thought that I would be doing it 22 years later and doing it as a very significant part of my job. I mean, it's basically my job now. So that wasn't even, it was unthinkable, that could possibly happen. But just as a consequence of doing it every single day, and I wrote and have written every single day about Arsenal for basically 22 years now, it has grown into what it is. So it wasn't a conscious decision to say, I want to build a career around football content. I think that's something people can do now because it seems clear that that's something people can do, whether it's a podcast or a website or a YouTube channel or whatever else. You can see that other people have done it and say, well, I fancy doing a bit of that, and this is how I'm going to do it. But when I started, it just wasn't feasible even. It wasn't imaginable that you could do what I've ended up doing with ArseBlog. So it's completely accidental. I mean, it is a consequence, obviously, of working and doing the work and putting in the hours and getting up every day to do what I do. It is a consequence of that. It's not just like one day it happened. I had to work for many, many years for it to get to where it is now with, it was a hobby. It wasn't a financial thing. But it is completely accidental, or organic might be another way of putting it. If you were in marketing, you might say it was organic rather than accidental. But that's the truth of it. I can't sit here and tell you or tell anyone else I had a master plan to do what I'm doing. It just sort of happened.
Well, to transition away from you and a bit more towards the club, before we come on to the sort of on-pitch matters, I think as neutral fans, one of the topics that we hear a lot about Arsenal from the outside is that it's the most expensive ticket in town, so to speak. I wanted to ask from your perspective as a fan, how bad is it really in terms of the cost of going to watch Arsenal live? And do you think the club has a responsibility to its supporters to try and make that experience more affordable?
To be perfectly honest, this isn't something I feel particularly qualified to talk about because I'm not a season ticket holder. I live in Dublin. I get over to some games. I'm lucky enough to be able to get tickets via friends when I want to go. But I don't think it's a problem that is specific to Arsenal. I don't even think that Arsenal is necessarily the most expensive ticket because of the way that season tickets are broken down with cup games and things like that. I think it's a wider problem for football that the affordability is like there is a danger of, that you price out the next generation of fans. That is the real danger, I think, of high ticket prices, not just at Arsenal, but across the Premier League and in football in general. I'm sure.
Especially in England.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Barcelona for a few years, and Barcelona tickets were really expensive in comparison to the cost of living in Barcelona and the average wage in Barcelona. A lot of Barcelona tickets were very, very expensive, but it's not a story you hear a great deal of in the media. But yes, the Premier League it's I think it's a consequence of the money that is in the Premier League, and as well, there is a demand from fans to spend big on players and to spend big on wages to make your team competitive. And I'm not saying this is fans' fault or anything like that, because I think that would be the wrong way to approach it. But I also think that wages are extremely high in the Premier League. Clubs do spend a lot of money. And I think one of the consequences of that, which is an unfortunate side effect for fans, is that the money has to come from somewhere. It's not always owners with deep pockets, and clubs will say, well, we've got X amount of demand, therefore we can put up ticket prices by X amount, and there might be a little bit of churn, but we know that we've got so many more people waiting. Like, I don't know how many people are on the Arsenal season ticket waiting list, 80,000, 100,000, it's crazy. So there's that aspect of it allows clubs to put prices up. But I just don't really know what the answer is to this, because as with most things in life, prices never come down, even if there's a good reason for those prices to come down, whether it's football tickets or whether it's something as fundamental and basic and necessary as energy costs, which we've all experienced over the last couple of years, right? Energy costs went through the roof. Have they really come down? No, they just don't, and that's an unfortunate aspect of the society that we live in. So I think it would be great to make football more affordable. And to be fair, over the years, Arsenal have done some things like for the Carabao, for the League Cup games, 10 £10 tickets for kids, for under 18s or under 16s or whatever it is. So they have done certain things, but they are, as I suppose, what's the word I'm looking for here? The economic demands of the Premier League play into the decision making that clubs make, and Arsenal aren't any different from any other in that respect.
Yeah, in order to make a change at that level, there would need to be a more widespread change to the restructuring of how it all works. I guess, like you said, they have such overheads, and there's a supply and demand issue when you've got so many people on a waiting list. It's sort of, I think, a bit lower down the pyramid. The problem is actually a lot worse. It doesn't get mentioned as much that in the lower leagues, the prices can be quite outrageous considering the level and considering the demand, when the stadiums are half empty in most cases. And I think that's a much bigger problem, actually, than the one that's going on in the Premier League. Because in a lot of cases, it's hard to justify bringing the cost down when you've got so many people clamoring to go to that particular event. It's like anything. Glastonbury's expensive, right? Because everybody wants to go to it. So
Glastonbury sells out.
Yeah.
If you're in charge of a football club and you've got, I don't know, 7,000 in a 15,000 seater ground, you have to maybe reconsider your options. The thing with Premier League is like,
that's it.
It's 60,000 at Arsenal every week, and tickets are like gold dust,
Yeah, that's it in the Premier League. And I think I guess maybe there's the sort of jokes about Man City, aren't there? But other than that, it seems to be the case that I imagine pretty much every stadium is sold out every week. So it's like a Glastonbury situation for them. But in in League One and the Championship, and even, in some cases in League Two, it's like £25, £27 a ticket which obviously is not as much as the Premier League, but given the fact that there's 3,000 out of 12,000 people there in some of these cases, it's doesn't make a lot of sense. But let's do a little bit of the on-pitch stuff, because I'm really, really curious to get your take on a couple of big figures in the recent history of Arsenal. So after some very negative times in the modern era, where it did get quite dark there for a while, just how impressive a job has Mikel Arteta done? And do you think he actually gets the appropriate amount of credit, or do you think people sort of they're quick to forget just how bad it was only a few years ago.
I think most Arsenal fans recognize that what Mikel Arteta has done is extremely impressive, because it wasn't just that he was taking over from Unai Emery, a coach who didn't work, because I think he was the wrong coach at the wrong time. But also there were years of stagnation, if that's the right way to put it, maybe worse, under Arsene Wenger, where year on year the team became less and less competitive. The level of the players dropped to the point where, ultimately Arsenal fell out of European places. And some people will say, well, that's on Mikel Arteta. I don't think it is. I think it's to do with the way the club recruited players for a long time. So I think most fans recognize that the job he's done has been really incredible, not least because it is his first job. It's his first job as a manager, and he had to come in and basically knock everything down and rebuild it again, which is no small task. And it's the sort of job I think that many managers would, more experienced managers would say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's too difficult. They would have recognized the difficulty of doing that. The thing is, as well, if we talk about Arteta and we talk about, what he's done, I think we also have to give the club some credit for sticking with him, but for recognizing that they had somebody who was, even if he was completely inexperienced, capable enough to do that, to make the hard decisions, to be ruthless about certain players, to demand more of everybody, to raise the standards to the level that he has. And Arsenal have competed for the Premier League for 2 seasons in a row, and that hasn't happened for a very, very long time, since actually the best years of Arsene Wenger. Arsenal would, the 98 double, Arsenal were competitive, but there were a couple of years where they just weren't. They didn't compete for the league with Manchester United. They ended up in second or third or whatever it was. So it's been fantastic to watch, actually. And the idea that your team or your club is capable of competing for the biggest trophies is something that I think felt a very, very distant hope or dream not that long ago, and Mikel Arteta has brought that back.
Are the Arsenal fans able to really enjoy? I know it's difficult to enjoy just coming up short against Man City, but like you said, given the context that a few years ago that would have been a dream, just to be coming so close and competing for titles until the very end with, arguably the best team in the world. If they weren't around, then Arsenal probably would have won the last 2 league titles. Are the fans able to, from the outside, they'll get a lot of trolls and a lot of, stupid stuff on Twitter that ultimately it doesn't matter because came second, whatever. But are they actually able to really drink it in and realize, this is what it's all about after years of sort of being in the background? Now they are getting that feeling again. Have you found that the fans, the atmosphere is still really positive despite falling short?
Yeah, I look, I can't speak for Arsenal fans in general. I can only speak for myself and say that it has been really enjoyable. And it's, part of the enjoyment is, well, I was going to say the fact that you don't win it is obviously very frustrating, but the fact you're in it right to the end of the season is really, really enjoyable. And I was over for the final game of last season, and everybody pretty much knew that Manchester City were going to win their game. So it didn't really matter what we did in our final game against Everton. But the fact that there was like even an outside chance, on top of everything that we'd experienced throughout the season, the record number of wins, the commitment of the team, the way that they played, scoring so many goals, it lent itself to an atmosphere that was, clearly appreciative of the season that we'd had. So even with the disappointment, I think, again, I can't speak for Arsenal fans, but I didn't get the sense that there was massive frustration that we didn't win the league last season, that it was somehow our own fault, if you know what I mean. You're up against a team like Manchester City. People were in good spirits. The sun was shining. The songs were being sung. and it was an enjoyable day, even if we didn't win the trophy. I think, having been there or thereabouts twice, I suspect that maybe next season there might be higher expectations, and that might make it a little more difficult to enjoy if we fall short of those. But from my own experience, I can tell you, it's far better watching a team that falls short at the last hurdle and finishes second, but has been great all season, than a team which sort of stumbles its way to eighth and, wins a few games here, loses a few games there. That's not fun. That's really not any fun. In the context of what the expectations are around Arsenal. So I've really enjoyed the last two seasons. I think we've taken big steps forward. I think the progression and the development of the team has been obvious. And, if enjoying football was only ever about winning something at the end of the season, why celebrate a goal? Why celebrate anything during the season? So, from my perspective, it's been great fun.
Now, as someone who runs a blog and a podcast and is very much, in the thick of it, even through the summer with Arsenal, what is on the grapevine regarding the transfer market? What are you hearing? What are you seeing popping up? What are your sort of hopes and expectations for the transfer market for Arsenal? How big do they need to go, in your opinion?
They've gone pretty big the last couple of seasons. Arsenal spent a lot of money. We can talk about the work Mikel Arteta did, and he's done a great job, no question. But also Arsenal have spent a lot of money. They brought in top players. So I don't quite know how big they need to go. I don't think they need necessarily big stellar signings, but what they might need are some players to come in and boost the floor of the squad, if you like, rather than the ceiling. So if you're looking at players going out, it's probably going to be the likes of Emile Smith-Rowe, Eddie Nketiah, Reece Nelson. So those kinds of players who've done good stuff with Arsenal and who have contributed, they're probably going to move on. So they need to bring in players who can flesh out the squad a bit. In terms of who those players might be, Arsenal are keeping their cards very close to their chest. There really hasn't been a lot rumored or not much doing the rounds on the grapevine because Arsenal have been very, very quiet. There's a bit of chat at the moment about the Italian defender Riccardo Calafiori, but whether or not that's got any legs, we'll have to wait and see. They apparently want a midfielder. They apparently want a forward. They were after Benjamin Sesko, as we know, before the Euros. That didn't happen. He decided to stay at RB Leipzig. So we just have to wait and see. But there's no names really doing the rounds. But I expect Arsenal to bring in probably 3 players in the window. When or who they are, I really don't know. They do their best to shut that kind of stuff out as much as possible. I think they like to do their work in private and, not have things play out publicly the way other clubs do.
Well, the Euros are coming to an end now, well, in the next week or so, and Arsenal will be back in action in friendlies in just a few weeks, actually, towards the end of the month. And then, of course, the Premier League is back in August. What excites you most about the return of Arsenal and the Premier League? It could be the development of a particular player or just something about the routine that you have when you watch games. What are you most excited about when you think about the season coming back?
I think the fact that, generally speaking, this is still a very very young Arsenal team. Players like Bukayo Saka, Gabriel Martinelli, only 22. You've got Martin Odegaard, Declan Rice, 24, 25. Kai Havertz, similar. William Saliba at the back, only 22 as well. There's a lot more for this team to do and a lot for this team to achieve. And I think the fact that they are still young and are developing and growing together is the most exciting thing for me, because the talent of these players is pretty obvious. It's now about, can Mikel Arteta get even more out of them year on year on year? Can he get more? He got more out of them last season than he did the season before, and the exciting thing for me is to see, can he get more out of them again for the season ahead? I think if he does, then Arsenal are going to be serious contenders again.
Thank you, Andrew, so much for coming on and sharing your insights with us today. Could you remind our listeners where they can read and listen to everything that your network is putting out?
ArseBlog.com is sort of the main hub. You'll find all the links to our podcast, our news site, our coverage of Arsenal women, our socials. All of that stuff is on there. Just ArseBlog.com.
Thanks so much again, Andrew, and best of luck for the next season.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening to the Sporticos Football Stories podcast. It was such a pleasure talking to Andrew today, and we can't wait to bring you more chats with fans from across the footballing landscape, from ex-pros to bloggers, YouTubers, and much more. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. If you really liked it, give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. That will really help us out so much. Thanks again, and catch you next time on the Sporticos Football Stories podcast.